The Trojan Horse War, Part 2, Abyss, Chapter 1. Dr. Mike Sonnenberg took another look at the man lying on the stretcher. The patient was strapped down by his wrists and ankles. He put the capped syringe and coiled IV line under his arm while he awkwardly tried to undo the restraint holding the patient in place. Mike shifted his feet ever so slightly to make sure they were secure in the straps on the floor so he wouldn't float away in this zero-G environment every time he pushed against the patient. Mike was a combat trauma physician in the Republic Fleet Medical Corps. As a doctor under the age of 30, he hadn't seen any trauma from actual combat, but for the last year, working at Taurus, an orbital in-processing station for personnel on their way to duty on the surface of Mars 200 miles below, he'd seen injuries from decompression, frostbite, and toxic inhalation. The soldier on the stretcher in front of him was an E4 specialist who'd become overheated and dehydrated from working too long in a spacesuit outside the station. The specialist was replacing a docking coupling on an RCC, and apparently his sergeant wouldn't let him come in until he was finished. The RCC had been parked right at port number 3 at the other end of the station. This was the only port that was compatible with RCCs, so there was a lot of pressure on the specialist and the sergeant to finish the job. There were 4 other RCCs in holding patterns a half a mile from the station. Well, does anyone know why there's been such an increase in traffic? Mike asked of anyone within earshot who might know the answer. His chief nurse, First Lieutenant Lucy Wells, shook her head as she adjusted the saline bag on the other end of the IV Mike was holding. "I haven't heard anything," she said. "Sir, I heard it had something to do with something going on out at the belt," his patient said, referring to the demilitarized asteroid belt that separated Republic territory from Triton territory. Wells laughed. "That's always what they say. Something out near the DMZ. The Tritons are always up to something." Mike nodded. "Captain Casey did a tour up at Boniface a year ago, and he said it was a lot quieter there than he thought it would be. Mostly training accidents." "Mostly? Then what were the rest? Tritons?" Mike shrugged. "I guess I never asked." Mike looked up above and saw an RCC glide past a 4-foot viewport, its docking lights flashing. "Hey, it looks like port number 3 is fixed." "It's just going to break again, I guarantee it," the patient said. "They got Sergeant Forrester to fix it, and he's going to take the counter-pressure gaskets out there without a sealed pouch. They'll be dry and brittle by the time he installs them, and they'll hold only maybe for 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, tops." "Jordan," Lieutenant Wells said to the patient, "do you think you would feel better in the cylinder? I know you're probably used to 0G, but I think there's a bed open there." "No, ma'am, I'll be fine here. Leave space in the cylinder for the newbies," Jordan responded and laughed as he pulled the IV out of Mike's hand and plunged it into Lieutenant Wells's carotid artery. She screamed, and Jordan pulled the needle out. The blood that pumped out of the artery went across the room and splashed against the medical cabinet attached to the wall. Much of the blood bounced off and went back into the air, forming small, shivering globules. "What?" Jordan started to say as he looked at Lieutenant Wells. She came out of her floor stirrups and drifted toward the bulkhead directly above them. She was holding her neck with both hands, trying to stem the bleeding. Mike looked down just in time to see Jordan bringing the bloody needle back at him. Mike managed to grab Jordan's wrist with both of his hands. "Drop it," Mike said. "I can't. I want to, but I can't." Mike twisted the patient's wrist. He brought it around so far that if he went any further, it would break. He looked up at Lieutenant Wells and made a decision. He pushed off the floor and let go of Jordan's wrist. As he glided towards Lieutenant Wells, he felt the needle in Jordan's hand puncture the right leg of his military fatigue pants and cut a deep furrow through skin and muscle. Mike winced and heard Jordan scream in confusion. He floated to Wells, who was gasping and kicking her legs futilely, trying to reach a wall. She was stuck in midair and panicking, forgetting all her zero-G experience and training. Mike caught her by the elbow. His momentum carried them to the hatch on the outside corridor. He pounded the open/close pad next to the door and took a look back at Jordan as the way to the corridor slid open. Jordan had actually broken the strap that had held his left wrist. He was holding the syringe in his teeth as he undid the straps over his ankles. Mike pushed Wells through the doorway. Her uniform blouse was soaked with blood, and Mike guessed she'd probably already lost a pint. He pulled open a drawer next to the door and brought out a box of self-sealing Clipasol pads. His hands were so wet with Wells' blood that the box slipped away from them and tumbled end over end back into the room. Jordan saw it and pushed off of the stretcher with both of his feet. He had a glazed look in his eyes, as if he were staring at something light years away. Mike hooked his feet back in the doorway to the corridor and stretched his body far enough to snatch the box of Clipasol pads. Jordan crashed into him, sending both of them toward the doorway. Mike grabbed the edge of the door with his feet and his free hand and used his body to block Jordan and prevent him from getting into the corridor. Jordan brought the needle down at Mike's face in an overhand grip. Mike blocked it with the forearm that held the box of bandages and brought his knee up into Jordan's stomach. Jordan gasped, and Mike pushed off of him, sending his former patient back in the direction of the stretcher while Mike floated backwards towards the doorway in the corridor. Once he was in the corridor, Mike punched the open/close pad on the other side, and the door hissed shut just as Jordan was rebounding toward it. Mike slid the lever-marked lock to the right and punched his 4-digit code into the keypad beneath it, sealing Jordan inside. Jordan pounded on the square portal in the middle of the door while Mike ripped open the Clipasol box and brought out a long strip of self-sealing bandage. "Here, Lieutenant Wells, let me," he said as he pulled her hands away from her neck. Blood sprayed and formed little trembling spheres in the weightless environment. Mike caught a glimpse of the Martian horizon swing past outside a portal further up the corridor as he pressed the Clipasol against Lieutenant Wells' crimson neck. He wrapped the rest around her neck and held pressure on her artery. She looked pale. Albert Bain, a large orderly in green scrubs, drifted around the corner at the far end of the corridor just as Mike was reaching for an intercom button. "Bain, give me a hand here," Mike called. The burly orderly was already on his way, deftly maneuvering up the short corridor despite his great size. "It's her carotid. Can you get her in the cylinder?" "Yes, sir. There's room. But couldn't we?" Bain started to say as he looked over Mike's shoulder at the examination room that held Jordan. "That exam room is contaminated. Stay away from it. Just get her in the cylinder right away." With one hand applying pressure to Lieutenant Wells' wound, Bain brought her weightless form back down the corridor in the direction he came from. Mike redirected his attention to the supply cabinets that lined the walls. He pressed his thumb against the print reader on the front of a metal locker a few feet to the left of the exam room door. Before the pneumatic locker door even slid all the way open, Mike found what he wanted. His bloody rubber-gloved hands left red smears on the pristine white packages that held a variety of Schedule Charlie 1 medications. As he used his feet to propel himself back over to the exam room door, Mike fitted a plastic vial containing a clear fluid into the chamber of an air gun. He cocked it, knowing he'd only get one shot. But when he punched the open/close pad next to the door and looked in the room, he knew he wasn't going to need it. Jordan's lifeless body bounced lightly in the far corner of the room in the middle of a swarm of suspended blood drops. As Mike glided closer, he saw the bloody pieces of broken glass from the window on the bandage cabinet that Jordan had used to open his wrist.